Welcome to UNCAGED, the show that celebrates thought leadership from today's top business leaders. The program provides a voice to amazing executives from around the globe who are shaping the world of business today and mapping the path to the commerce of tomorrow. Today, we are speaking with Paul Rubenstein. Hey, Paul, how are you?
Hey, good afternoon. No, good morning. Wait, I get confused.
Well, Paul, no matter what it is, it's great to have you on the show today. Paul is the Chief People Officer of Visier. He will talk to us a lot about people today and talent and the lovely market that we find ourselves in today, where people are calling it things like the Great Resignation. And I would say perhaps it's a moment where people are reinventing this world, and we're excited to hear Paul's thoughts on that reinvention. But before we get there, Paul, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career today.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm sort of an unusual bird. I'm a first-time Chief People Officer and somebody who hasn't worked in HR in probably like 20-something years. So I was with a bunch of other people, other heads of HR the last 2 weeks in a row in New York and San Francisco doing these roundtables. And it's a really strange path. My first job in HR, I was like, I don't know if I love this. But what I really did like was, and I remember we were having discussions about D&I, and I was like, well, and this is like 1990s D&I. I'm like, well, what does the data say? Where do we actually have lack of gaps in representation? Is this all about gender and ethnicity, or is there even some deeper sort of problem? I remember, one of these old school COBOL CICS mainframe systems, and some guy would download it into Lotus 123, and I would show up at my boss's office with this data on a green bar report, and he would look at me and go, oh, this data is wrong. You're not very good at your job. Maybe you should consider another career. And I was like, no, it's not me. It's the data chain. And I was very lucky to, that was the era as modern HR systems were coming to pass. And I, found that my real skill was having a big vision for how this all flowed together. And what I think my actual skill was getting people to spend money in advance of their confidence in their own capability to spend it and execute on technology vision, because it was all new in HR.
Yeah, and clearly, like, HR is going through a lot of changes now, and I can only imagine what you guys are working on.
Yeah, and so it's actually sort of a culmination of some really interesting things. So like I said, I was able to go out and convince people to spend money on the first biggest large expense HR ever had. And a lot of this work was called HR transformation, right? The whole thing was, how do you actually have a more effective or efficient HR function and modernize it? This is like when companies were still coming together and globalization was happening and all this tech was new. So we'd go out and we'd transform the HR function. And I'd recommend all this tech and outsourcing and shared services, all this stuff that's commonplace now. But I tell you, at the end of these projects, I don't know if the HR function was actually that much more strategic. Just putting in some technology and building the capacity to do strategic things doesn't necessarily mean you're going to deliver better insights to the business. And what I saw over my career, but for me, it was great in consulting.
That's a eureka moment right there.
Right?
But,
yeah. Well, it's
one that I see in almost every area of technology. It's incredible, because a lot of the sell on technology is to make it seem like it's insightful. But in reality, technology is only insightful as you allow it to be, as the analysis allows it to be, and how the actions around that analysis are, right?
Well, what you find is most people, when they buy their tech, they think the value is created in the delivery of the tech. And it's all about, like, how many heads do we need? And, whole people's jobs are consumed with creating and delivering the tech, but they forget that this is a means to an end.
Yeah, absolutely.
For HR to have cleaner data isn't the same as delivering insights that somebody makes a better decision. So anyway, I was in consulting, recommending all this tech. I was at a big giant consulting firm. And one day we're like, well, what are we going to do about big data? And like 8 years ago, the early days of people analytics, I saw a company that I was like, we should invest in them. They had a totally different approach to, people analytics. It was like, instead of creating teams of people with specialized tools, they were like, everybody should be able to use analytics. It should be, you shouldn't need to go to somebody to change your data warehouse and all this other stuff. Instead of creating value for consulting firms and IT departments, let's create values for end users. They started in HR. It was beautiful software. Like, I know it sounds weird. I fell in love with a piece of software. Anyway, I went on to do some other stuff.
That's some good software.
Yeah, it's some good software, right? Because, when I saw it, to me, it was the first time out of all of the years of recommending software, it was the first one that elevated the insights that HR could deliver, right? Rather than efficiency. To me, it was storytelling. It was pattern recognition. It was the difference between having a good, making sure, HR, the way you consume it outside of, as a business person, sometimes you get a good HR person, sometimes you don't. And it shouldn't be dependent on it. This allowed us to raise the floor. I saw this. They got round D, their series D. They said, come work for us. I call my husband up. I'm like, I'm taking a pay cut and I'm going to work at this company. He's like, you're crazy.
You're crazy.
And so I got there, and the first year I worked in value engineering, and I was like and I became sort of obsessed with the moment somebody sees a new piece of information, do they actually make a better decision? Do they actually change their course of action? Because if you think about management, you've had managers, right, man? How much of it is based on intuition or, the hand-me-down experience, or what you know, or inertia, right? I have to quickly make a decision.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many amazing examples of how companies go through that phase of not having any data, then they have data, and then it's really what you make of that data. And in the HR area, it's always been, in early days. I remember I was at a large agency who had to go through a round of layoffs, and the data clearly outlined that there were worse performers than others. And yet when it came to the layoffs, the CEO made the decision to just ask every group to lay off 10% of their team. And I was like, that's horrible. Like, that's not how we should have read the data.
That's not how, and it's not fair.
Yeah.
It doesn't get to deeper truth about people. And it's not equitable. And by the way, it leaves value on the table. So how do we turn around? Like, okay, when you go out and drive in Miami, you know how to drive around, but don't you click on Google Maps or Waze to get the latest traffic? Why would you go out and make a people decision with relying only on instinct? Why wouldn't you actually look at the whole data? I mean, there's a whole trove of human psychology that distorts your decision making. Recency bias, sunk cost fallacy, all these different human conditions.
Right.
That data can actually, and here was the second thing I observed. Like, after all these years of advising heads of HR, I thought I would never become head of HR. But I saw something, and I realized that, A, I love the company. B, it was a great time for us to help focus. So I stepped into the role, and I've used it sort of as a living laboratory on what good looks like in it being a data-driven HR function. And there's a couple of things I've learned. The first one is, like, how do you collapse the distance between a good company strategy and where all the decisions are made, right? So I'm going to use a really simple one, timely, diversity and inclusion, okay? And by the way, as a first-time chief people officer, stepping into that topic, not having a lot of experience, is scary, right? Yeah. You're going to say the wrong thing, you're going to do the wrong thing, and so many people have not actually achieved changes in the diversity or culture of their organization. It's littered with, the field is littered with, people had good intent. But I sat and I remember all those presentations. You ever gone to a boardroom discussion on diversity? Somebody gets up and shows a graph that says, up and to the right, we're going to do this for insert population here. Women, people of color, LGBTQIA plus, whatever it is. Yet they come back a year later, it's like, well, we spent, training money and all this other stuff, but the market didn't work in our favor, or there's always excuse, because the decisions are actually made by individual hiring managers.
Right.
Because nobody shares HR data. Nobody turns around and says, how do I connect this bigger arc strategy to small individual decisions?
Yeah.
You know who's good at that? The CFO.
Right.
Anybody who's worked in a company knows that 12 times a year, you're a hero or a goat. You either look at the P&L, you reflect on it, and you correct something, but you're only going to go so many quarters before you're out if you don't actually respond to that data. So I'm sitting there saying, how do you get people to look at, have better context for that single decision? The next hire is the one that's going to change your arc of female representation. Is it your responsibility to hire both someone who's both talented and diverse, or are you going to make another excuse and just hire who's ever in front of you?
Yeah.
And so by the sharing of data with consistency and explanation, and leaving people to connect that single decision to a larger strategy, that's how sales works. Individual salespeople coming together for a collective goal. That's how marketing goes. Individual campaigns driving whole awareness. So, as chief HR officer, I've been obsessed with that, and we were actually able to.
That's it's such an amazing insight you're making, Paul, because the way I would look at it is that topics like diversity, equity, inclusion, especially if you look at last year at 2020, when we suddenly companies woke up to the fact that they had to wrestle down their DEI strategies. They needed to figure this out, right? Was companies were more obsessed with perception than they were with strategy. Business strategy. There wasn't a strategy of diversity. There was, we might be perceived as not being diverse, and that will be bad for us. And that was the mistake. And so I think what you're saying, which is you have to fundamentally align the commercial strategy connected in with this idea of diversity to make it systemic, right? And to fix it.
You have to believe that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And, like we've been arguing for many years over, the business case for diversity has always been there. I think we're past that point where it's just like the people who get it, it's just the right thing to do as human beings.
Right.
Okay. But when you think of coming out of the awful time, which, is the worst way to raise social consciousness, is to go through a tragedy like, the horrible things that happened to George Floyd, right?
Yeah.
Think of all the pledges and statements that were made by companies during that time. Imagine if somebody kept a record of those and goes back a year now and says, hey, it's just like you made a forecast to Wall Street. You're now, we're going to hold you accountable for that.
Yeah.
Pledges and statements are nice, but I believe that data and accountability, I believe that data is actually going to light the path to accountability and change.
I love it. I love that idea. And I think you're spot on that. So, I mean, DEI has certainly been one of the big areas that has been a focal point for HR. But I mean, you're right at the pulse of all of this stuff. And clearly with Visier, you have access to treasure troves of data. Tell us more about this changing world of work in some of these other areas that are popping.
I love it. So, we're watching it like, Great Resignation. How many articles have been written in? I'm not sure if, what came first. The Great Resignation or the articles about Great Resignation causing more people to resign. Sometimes I wonder. And then I also wonder, it's also a great time to hire. We're growing our company. Yeah, we're losing people just like everyone else, but people are sitting there saying, well, why do I work where I work? Right. What is the, do I understand my company? Is there something better? Where do I find meaning? Right. The weirdest thing that I went to a benchmarking session on Great Resignation, and the most interesting discussion was about boomerangs. People who just said, the grass might be greener, and they were back in 90 days. We've had that too happen in our company, which is, both affirming and scary at the same time. Oh. But let's go back for a second, because there's an interesting lesson in here that when we think about that diversity, like the motion of, hey, everyone, connect your individual decision and make it data focused, not just, your experience focused. Great resignation. I will tell you, as head of HR, whoever, if you were a hiring manager, whoever the last person resigned, you would come into my office and say, this is the trend. Doesn't matter, whether you have the full picture. It's, a lot of people will just put their own experience and call it the trend.
Right.
And what I realized is, once again, people need deeper insights so that they're spending time. I'll give you an example, Bant. You ever been to a call center?
Oh, I used to be the CEO of a company that owned thousands of call centers.
Okay, so follow me on this, right? How hard is it to be a call center manager? Maybe you got 25 people reporting to you. It's busy all day.
It's intense.
It's intense. And so somebody comes into your office and they're like, I need your attention. I need your attention. And so you often hear noise. And you're like, that person is coming to my office complaining a lot about things. Maybe they're the person who's going to leave next. But how do you actually understand noise versus signal?
Correct.
People analytics is about cutting through that noise and helping everyone understand the signal. So when I looked at resignation, like other companies, our resignations were up, our turnover was up. But when I teased apart the data, it was actually only two groups, two career levels that were truly, what I call, extraordinary in the change in their, and they were driving more than almost 60% of our turnover, just two career levels. And so helping people say, what is signal? What is noise? Here's the signal. What should you do about it? And then be able to take it all the way down to, just like you do in marketing, how you're able to identify based on the way people click through things or their actions or their last interaction, their propensity to buy. Machine learning and common sense analysis of data, forget even beyond just machine learning, can point people managers in the right direction to say, these are the people that are truly highest risk of exit. They may be introverts, they may be quiet. So
I think it's a really interesting point. I like the idea of understanding the signals. It's been fascinating to see the press on the topic of the Great Resignation. And, all of us, when we sit down with friends and family, we see people that are shifting or changing their lives, or in some cases feel forced to. And those are the people that I sometimes feel get misrepresented. I was out with a group of friends here in Miami who were all New Yorkers. They had been working remotely. They had been working remotely successfully for companies that had had their best years ever. And yet all of their management was now forcing them to return to New York to go back into the office. And a good 50% of those people, were basically saying, I'm not going back. And it wasn't that, and they were sad. They wasn't that they were making it out of joy. They were saying, I'm not going back because it makes no sense. I've had my best year ever for the company. I'm doing my best work I've ever done. And there makes no sense for me to work in a way that makes no sense anymore, right?
So you are seeing an early signal. No, it's not even an early signal. You are seeing the shift. And it isn't just about where I work. It's what I work on. It's about understanding my career and what a modern career looks like and the trade-offs I'm willing to make. It's about understanding the whole human, like what is happening on the other side of that screen, our sensing mechanisms outside of the office are going to have to be different. It's empathy for, the fact that we've raised a generation of people who may never be able to buy houses. There's this whole newer, deeper human truth and an understanding that people aren't just motivated by what motivated you,
right?
Which might be climbing a corporate ladder. They don't share your same value system about hierarchy, right? Understanding this whole deeper human truth, something that goes beyond a performance rating,
Totally.
or a sales quota attainment, but actually looks at what did they work on.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think the word like holistic makes, you have to think about these people, everybody as a whole person. And, you know, the data that hit me as a company leader was we had our best year ever. You know, we're working more efficiently than ever before. How can I
go backwards?
How can I proclaim that people have to go back to an office when they're working really well? Like they're happy. Like, why would I force that? It's insane, right? That's bad. That's bad use of, like, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, but I think
using the data, right?
It's not as simple as going back to the office. It's about going forward. I will tell you, when I look at burnout, and burnout is real, it's the gamification of work because of true full remote work is terrible. I watch this behavior where, your 30-minute segment on Zoom, the time is up, I got to go to the next meeting, right? I lost it with one of my employees the other day. I'm like, we're now getting to the good stuff. You can be late for a meeting. Or the notion that, it was the space in between meetings.
Yeah.
The work actually got done and people made sense of the meetings. Because when you think about work, like, do you have a driveway?
I live in a big building,
okay,
so
but,
I guess we have a driveway. Yeah,
you know what a driveway looks like. Imagine those
Yes.
paving stones, right?
Yeah,
it's individual blocks of work.
Yeah,
if you put the paving stones too close together and drive over them, they crumble.
Right.
It's all the sand in between that makes them move with ease, and that makes it a smooth road to ride over.
I hear you.
The sand in between.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that's really, again, coming to your point, which is how do you actually read this information, the data? How do you see what is actually working, what is not, what is missing, what is not? I mean, Paul, you have a better sense of than anybody who the winners and losers are going to be in this new space. Give me a sense of the successful companies of 2022.
So it remains to be seen, but I don't actually think we'll know I don't think we'll know how this sorts out until the end of 2023. But I think there will be winners and losers. I think the winners will understand this deeper human truth. They will realize that the old telephone game of management, where you cascade it down. And by the time the CEO's strategic vision gets all the way down to the person who actually makes choices about work and customer and all that other stuff, CEOs are tired of that. They want to collapse the distance to impact, right?
Yeah.
So that, small decisions are better aligned with their strategy without all those, interests of the middle that muck it up are.
Yeah.
And vice versa. People want to see how their individual work connects with the strategy and actually impacts the company.
Yeah.
Like, it isn't just about purpose in, am I doing good for the world? People want to be able to connect to the purpose of the company. Maybe you make toilet paper rolls. And, it's hard to come up with like we're saving the world, et cetera. It doesn't matter.
Well, I think if you worked in making toilet paper rolls during the pandemic,
pretty critical right now.
you might be a critical employee. Yes.
I need a better example. But this, everybody wants to understand, that they've made a contribution either to a larger purpose or to the company goals. They want to be able to find their place and not be diminished, right? You're just that.
Well, let me ask you, Paul, a data question, because one of the things I like to do with data is I start out with lots of different data points, and then I kind of boil it down, because I kind of find that central keystone of data, right? The keystone of data that is really the key piece of data. And as we move to this world where we're working in hybrid and remote teams, is there a specific kind of data that you would say is important for me to know to assess kind of what's working, what's not working for those teams?
Great question. There are a couple of what I'll call new, higher fidelity, more interesting things around human measurement that I'm just absolutely fascinated with, right? First of all, let's do the easy one. Sentiment analysis, engagement data. any company that's still doing once a year engagement data really needs to take a hard look at themselves. You wouldn't ask your customer or your spouse how you're doing, how's our relationship once a year. You need to be really getting into the heart of issues, et cetera, multiple times a year, right? As frequently as you think is. And the second is the type of things you're asking. Like I will tell you, belonging. What do you experience? Understanding this, what people experience at work, and experience surveys are very important. And also understanding people's experience outside of work. Mm-hmm. What you'll notice is if something bad happens to somebody outside of work, they hold you accountable for it in work. If they read an article about how managers mistreated somebody, they are actually looking for that to happen with them, and heightened awareness within your company. So it's important to understand that whole, really get to the next level of experience. Here's the second one, network analysis. Mm-hmm. You've seen all those memes about, consultants' digital strategy. The greatest thing to accelerate digital strategy was the pandemic. It's true, right? Look at us right now.
Absolutely.
I can turn around and I can map me connecting with you as well as every other Zoom meeting I've had, right? I can take a look and understand who's stranded versus connected, which is especially important for new employees. Are we actually onboarding them if you can't physically see them? Look at the strength of connections internally versus externally to start to understand sales behavior and customer behavior. Being able to hold up a lens to everybody's network to say, do I have a diverse network or not?
Right.
I'll take it a step further, right? People read your tweets and your LinkedIn stuff and everything you write, and they do sentiment analysis around it without you even taking a test. Somebody can easily look at, I've been looking at all kinds of cool technologies that will plug into Zoom, analyze who was dominant versus not in this meeting, who spoke the most. I can understand sentiment, tone, word count, natural, and be able to hold a mirror up to, say, do we actually have an inclusive meeting or behavior, or, or help you understand your style? Did you really connect with that customer? There's all types of data from both aggregate all the way down to individual. And it's not just about, and it's also understanding the relationship with the data change. It's not just for management, it's for employees. Me as an employee, if I'm going to give data, I got to get data back. Help me understand how I develop, what I'm good at or not. Help me understand my career patterns.
I love that. I tell you, what you just were talking about with evaluating sentiment and tone from a Zoom meeting is fascinating. That's a really, really interesting idea. As you mentioned earlier, call centers were probably one of the earlier utilizers of machine learning in terms of trying to do natural language processing of consumer or customer feedback, right? And I love the idea of applying that to Zoom conversations when appropriate. That's a fascinating idea. So, Paul, I wanted to kind of shift gears because I saw that you work also with something called the People Intelligence Alliance.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd love to know more about what that is and how that fits in.
Yeah, that's sort of a passion project. I believe that, look, I love underdogs too. So this is a big part of it, right? There's all kinds of cool technology out there. There are people it's the age of the startup. It's the age of innovation. It's easy to bring things to market. And, I see a lot of old school thinking out there, especially in companies and their tech platforms. They just want, just give me one vendor who gives you everything. And, if it doesn't even have to be that great. Or just take reporting from, this system, et cetera. That's like not understanding a whole person or your whole organization.
Yeah.
The beauty of seeing patterns and unlocking both individual and organizational performance comes from looking at all the data. So learning systems, right? What did I get trained on? Let's look at maybe Jira to see how many story points did an engineer complete, or how many calls did a salesperson go on. Let's look at the performance management system. Let's look at the compensation system. Let's look at the old school HRIS to see who got promoted and your career progression. Let's look at the recruiting system to see where you came from. It's taking this notion of being able to put people data at the center of lots of other things and not rolling it off, and the interoperability of data across multiple vendors. Like, let it free, man. These, the age of it's my data structure, it's my proprietary information, and I can't match it to anything else. That's gone.
Right.
Let it free. The beauty exists and the knowledge exists in patterns, not a system.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because what you're saying kind of leads perfectly into my next question, which is, I'm getting a sense from you that the leader of HR and the leaders of the future for HR are essentially data scientists, and I'm curious kind of how you would describe that modern HR leader going forward.
So I don't know if it's a data science, but here are the things that I gave a lot of advice to HR leaders, but you know what? Yeah. My advice was better after I had been a P&L leader, right? I will tell you that I think that chief HR officers of the future, they really have to go back to the basic science of industrial psychology, even if you have to hire a couple of IOs for you. And understand basic human, the basics of that, and be able to tap into that. Yeah, you have to understand data to the extent that the CFO understands accounting. The days of the controller becoming the CFO are gone. It's usually somebody who's in financial planning analysis or a banker, somebody who can tell stories and understands what the data should say and how to tell stories with it. That's the key, much less the data science. It's the data storytelling. I think somebody who understands, not just leadership development, but frontline people manager development, right? It's you can develop all the leaders you want, but man, if you don't have good frontline people managers, and then finally, somebody who's a little bit experienced engineer, somebody who can say, what do I want my employees to, what do I want the path to feel like? And that's a little bit culture, that's a little bit process engineering, it's a little bit being able to stick together the right tech, but it's also it's also editorial tone, content curation, experience curation. So I don't know, Bant, what is that?
No, I mean, it's a lot of characteristics. I think that some of those have been timeless for sure. Others, I think, are new in the mix, right? And I think that engineering, the data elements are really powerful new skills, really, to make sure that you feel comfortable with. And I think those are going to be key. And certainly they're going to play a big role in 2022. So Paul, big last question. Tell me the big key things for 2022 that I should be keeping in mind in terms of HR.
Oh man, 2022?
Yeah.
First of all, number one, how will we land the post-pandemic work world? How is that going to happen? That's number one. Number two, how will an inflationary economy change the way we deal with comp and people changing jobs? Those two things are colliding, and it's really interesting to see.
Great point.
Number three, we're going to go back to the office.
Yep.
But I hesitate to say go back to. We need to go forward to a new office. We need to go forward into a new environment where people come together, not because they have to, but because they want to, where people understand that they come together with intent, not just out of obligation. And that will lead to purpose-driven work. Here's another one. All those people who graduated college, or all those people who you hired, you've never actually met. By the way, they're shorter or taller than they look on the Zoom screen. That's like one of the first things you learn.
I mean, I can tell you, we had our holiday party, and I was up in New York. We've hired about 50 people this year, 50 new employees in the New York area, and I'm meeting these people who, the odd thing about the digital era is not that you don't know them. It's actually that you actually have intimate connections with them because you're in calls with them constantly. So these 50 people, I felt like I'd known them for years, even though I'd only worked with them for months. And when you met them physically, you certainly had a moment where you're like, oh, she's much taller than I would have imagined, or he's not as tall, or so on and so forth. And I had kind of a split kind of perspective on that, which was maybe it's better to hire people by not meeting them, because maybe that's more equitable, strangely enough.
So there is a certain sort of equality that comes with it, but you also saw the whole person.
Totally.
Like, look, you are seeing this much of my house and my world and my body.
Yeah.
And by the way, our sound is compressed. You don't hear the whole dynamic range of our speech.
Right.
And so how can we actually have a whole human truth if we don't both see, hear, and experience each other's presence?
Yeah.
And so we're going to have, if we quickly recontracted with our employees around, being totally, dispersed and truly remote, there's a new recontracting as we come into, office-based hubs that won't, where our relationship coming to work will be different. We've got to find new lunch places. We've got to find new norms of hugging and socialization. Yeah. There's a lot of work to be done. And this is about culture. A lot of people did a lot of great work. And some of us survived on social capital that we built up before the pandemic.
Yeah.
We got to go replenish that, man.
Yeah. Paul, I've loved talking to you today about this. I mean, anybody out there that wants to know about HR and what's happening in the space, definitely reach out to Paul Rubenstein. Paul, tell them a little bit about how they can reach you. Where can they find you?
Oh, LinkedIn's easiest, or anything on the Visier page. Visier's like the darling of the people analytics industry, and we're the cool kids in human capital and in analytics right now. So it's actually a really cool feeling. I've never been the cool kid in my life.
I love it. Well, Paul, thank you so much for being on UNCAGED today. We've been speaking to Paul Rubenstein. He's the Chief People Officer at Visier, and we've been talking about a lot of topics. One is really the use of data effectively to, one, make the most of talent in your organization, two, evolve that talent and evolve the organization in that process, and three, where things are going and how you can use that data to kind of maybe stay one step ahead and continue to build a successful organization. Paul, thank you so much for being on the show today, and I look forward to having you back.
Thank you for having me. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Cheers.